11,700 years ago, with the onset of climate change across the world, the Holocene Epoch came into being. Out of the throes of the Pleistocene Ice Age and into the world we know today, early humans had established themselves across most of the world, from America to Australia, and were poised to take over the world. Gone were the major threats of the Pleistocene. Dangerous megafauna, crumbling glaciers and chilling winds were, for the most part, gone, and humanity stood on the verge of civilization. In the Middle East and much of Europe, early humans had settled down in permanent settlements and were driven by a major technological advancement: agriculture. This world was not without its challenges. Dangerous animals still threatened some settlements, bands of raiders created the origins of warfare, and disease was still a rampant threat. However, innovations were sparking, and populations were growing, and safety could be found in the proto-villages that were cropping up across the ancient world. Holocene, taking a look at how the world left the Pleistocene and plunged into this new dawn with farming tools at the ready. This is a journey that will span thousands of years and thousands of miles, so sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. The Pleistocene is what we typically imagine when we think of early humans, or at least the dawn of man. Stone Age tribes spread out across the globe, gathering the wild crops they could and defending themselves against the local megafauna. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions and bears, gigantic marsupials and huge ground sloths existed just a stone's throw away from our modern time. And perhaps, had it not been for these Stone Age hunters, they would still be around today. While climate change likely played a part in reducing numbers of these ancient beasts, there is extensive evidence of early humans hunting many of these animals, and some species actively disappeared with the arrival of humans in their native habitats. While megafauna disappeared before the onset of the Holocene, the end of the Pleistocene was characterized by global climate change that generally saw a rise in temperature in all of the world's continents. This rise in temperature would ultimately put an end to the last ice age, a time in which glaciers held huge quantities of seawater, reducing global sea levels. The fall in sea levels across the Pleistocene led to the presence of several land bridges, which today are sunken beneath the waves. Using these land bridges, people and animals were able to access areas that are now isolated, such as North America and Australia. When the temperatures rose, the glaciers melted, releasing much of the water that was trapped inside them. Such great quantities of water were released that sea levels rose more than 120 meters, or 400 feet, at the end of the Ice Age. This was a gradual process that did not happen at the very start of the Holocene. The glaciers started to melt around 19,000 years ago, and the melting reached its zenith, thus ending the last glacial maximum between 11 and 10,000 years ago. Therefore, the end of the Ice Age coincides with the beginning of the Holocene. As the temperatures rose and the ice melted, environments across the world began to change too. This is what led to the natural decline in megafauna, where humans were not directly responsible. Some animals were too specialized to cope with the changes in their world, and thus could not cope, condemning them to the ancient past forever. One of the most drastic changes in habitats can be found across Eurasia. In the Pleistocene, Eurasia was characterized by the mighty Mammoth Steppe, the world's largest continuous habitat in known natural history. The steppe, composed of wide, dry grasslands, open plains, and rocky hills, stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to what is today China in the east. In the north, it stretched from the Arctic Circle and covered land as far south as southern Europe and the Middle East. The Mammoth Steppe supported colossal numbers of megafaunal mammals such as woolly rhinos, cave bears, the Irish elk, Elasmotherium, and of course the legendary woolly mammoth. Early humans adapted well to the steppe setting up nomadic temporary camps across it as they moved with the herds and hunted the megafauna, no matter how large. Environments such as the mammoth steppe disappeared as the earth became wetter and hotter, which saw the plains recede in favor of lush forests, both deciduous and coniferous depending on the location. The largest animals left behind in the land once ruled by mammoths now included bison, deer, aurochs, wolves, horses, and camels. Humans coped well with the change and were soon standing on the verge of some of the greatest changes our species has ever seen. For the most part, humans in the earliest throes of the Holocene were still hunter-gatherers. They relied upon hunting the vast populations of hoofed mammals that could be found the world over, using their sharp, stone-tipped spears and atlatls. At this stage, the plants they relied upon, berries, roots, grains, and tubers, were growing wild, but this was about to change. Between 10 and 12,000 years ago, in select areas of the world, primarily the Fertile Crescent, in what is now the Levant and Middle East, humans began to settle down into permanent communities that did not move with the seasonal migrations of animals. This coincided globally with the onset of agriculture in the world's ancient communities, which was not a single event, but a series of independent innovations influenced by environmental change and the arrival of human migrants in settlements where agriculture had not been developed. This new dawn of farming and settlement establishment was known as the Neolithic Revolution. Farming began when humans grasped the concept of seed domestication. In the Fertile Crescent, humans began planting grains, and with a lot of trial and error, realized that they could repeatedly sow and harvest them year on year. This was essentially providing that the crops didn't fail, an endless supply of food, which meant that humans didn't have to spend as much time hunting and gathering in the wilds to obtain sustenance. Of course, hunting did still take place, but planting seeds also meant that humans didn't need to travel constantly in search of new grounds. There was, theoretically, a constant supply of food at home. Over the centuries, humans began to take note of favorable characteristics in their crops to ensure they got the biggest, most resilient plants year on year. Choosing to sow the seeds from healthy plants with strong roots and large crops, for example, would ensure access to the best food possible over time. This was the dawn of selective breeding in plants. In 9500 BC, the Neolithic founder crops were domesticated, which would play huge parts in the diets of ancient peoples across the world. These crops, emmer, einkorn, barley, peas, bitter vetch, chickpeas, lentils and flax, can be found at archaeological sites across most of the Fertile Crescent and the adjacent areas, and were harvested en masse. Gradually, agriculture spread outwards from the Fertile Crescent. Very early Egyptian communities living on the banks of the Nile started growing their own crops around 8000 BC, with ancient farmers in China planting rice fields around the same time. Farmers in the Americas would independently discover agriculture shortly after, but different varieties of crops were available in the New World. Here, maize was a staple food, but tomatoes, potatoes, pepper, beans, and squash would accompany them. Agriculture would come to Western Europe much later, spreading by way of Greece as people exchanged cultures and migrated from A to B. Slowly, hunter-gatherer populations disappeared from the continent, and soon, the whole world. Only the most isolated communities remained as hunter-gatherers, and some tribes living extremely remotely, such as those in the Amazon rainforest, continue to hunt and gather today. Farming brought about more benefits than just a steady supply of food, however. With more food coming in, more people could reside in a settlement. With more people in a settlement, more defense was afforded, and technology could prosper. It wasn't just plants that were domesticated during the Neolithic Revolution. animals would soon come into the command and domain of humanity for meat, milk, furs, labor, and companionship. Humans had already domesticated the dog from populations of Pleistocene grey wolf, and by the time agriculture was discovered, dogs were faithful companions, helping humans to hunt and defend themselves against threats to the tribe. Through drawing animals close to human settlements, providing them with food and water, and ultimately making them dependent on human care, we could domesticate a handful of extremely useful animals. Now, we would have a steady supply of meat as well as plants, which would add yet another layer of reliability upon life in a settlement. The domestication of the sheep and goat were among the earliest of the Holocene advancements in animal husbandry, from wild populations of mouflon and ibex respectively. This occurred for the first time around 11,000 years ago, and allowed humans to gain steady access to meat and milk, as well as wool, in the sheep's case. Wool could be used to craft warmer outfits to ward off the cold nights and winters, and, like meat, was seasonally available year on year. This meant that humans no longer needed to rely entirely upon wild animal skins to protect themselves from the elements. Soon after, around 10,500 years ago, the first cattle started to appear in human settlements, descended from the now extinct aurochs. Cattle, being much larger than sheep, could provide a greater quantity of meat and milk, but could also be used eventually to pull plows and carts that would again reduce the amount of manual labor needed from humans in settlements. Then, in 8,500 BC, humans first domesticated the pig. Descended from wild boar that were, and still are, prevalent across Eurasia, the pig was yet another source of meat. Moreover, the dung of all of these animals could be used to fertilize the crops year on year, providing a boon to the quality and quantity of plants obtained in a harvest. Over time, donkeys and horses would follow suit. Used initially for meat and milk, and then for labor, horses would soon find themselves as mounts, a very early form of fast-paced transportation. On horseback, a human could cover ground much quicker, whether they were traveling from settlement to settlement or riding into war. Steadily, more and more animals would find themselves falling into the care of humans. Cats, chickens, quail, camels, guinea pigs, buffalo, yak, pigeons, and ducks are just a few examples of animals we have domesticated over the years following the advent of agriculture, which are used for innumerable tasks and purposes. With the power of animals and plants at our fingertips, it wouldn't be long before the first civilizations emerged in the ancient throes of the Holocene. One of the driving forces behind technological advancement in the early Holocene was the discovery and use of metal. Around 8,000 years ago, the first evidence of metalworking appears in the archaeological record, which comes in the form of small chunks of copper that were strung together to form decorative beads. These early examples of metalworking come from the Fertile Crescent, specifically in what is today northern Iraq. The advent of this new age of metal discovery would eventually lead early humans out of the Stone Age and into the Chalcolithic. Soon, humans would discover that metal was more durable and reliable than stone, and gradually, stone tools were phased out in favor of copper ones. Early humans would soon discover, around 4,500 BC, that when metal is heated up, it can be smelted into all manner of different forms. Stone bifaces were replaced by efficient copper knives, and durable axes were produced not only for combat, but to clear swathes of forest to obtain wood. Copper nails emerged to hammer pieces of wood together to create stronger structures, which in turn helped settlements to become more permanent with time. Of course, copper would not be the only metals that were harnessed throughout the early Holocene, and soon the world would transition into the Bronze and Iron Ages respectively. With bronze, humans could construct even more efficient axes and spearheads, but also new construction tools such as hammers and chisels, saws, and picks. With the advent of iron, all of these tools would become even stronger. But iron had a notable effect on the agricultural world too. Ploughs were constructed from iron in the Iron Age, which could quickly till the soil, making it ready for seeds. Moreover, these could be pulled by cattle, donkeys, or horses, making them even more efficient for time saving. Iron would also be used to craft reinforced, reusable sickles that could quickly and efficiently harvest crops when they ripened year on year. Soon, iron would prove useful for another means in these ancient settlements: weaponry and warfare. It is thought that humans may have participated in basic warfare since the Stone Age, where tribal raiders invaded the territories of others to gain resources for their own. The Neolithic shows great evidence of this in events such as the brutal massacre of Schlitz in what is today Austria. Around 5000 BC, more than 200 individuals were killed by blunt force trauma to the head, their skulls cracked with polished stones. Men, women, and children were among them, some of whom were also shot by arrows. Whoever perpetrated the massacre didn't stop at killing their victims. Archaeologists have also found evidence of missing limbs and severed heads, meaning that brutal warfare and raiding was a problem long before the advent of metal. It is not known specifically who these raiders were, but to overpower so many people, they were likely powerful, and were probably attempting to either take captives or steal their victims' provisions to further their own settlement. When the victims were killed, the raiders tossed the bodies into a trench where some of them appear to have been consumed by wild animals. Brutality, it would seem, characterized some groups of humans from the start. The harnessing of metal allowed humans to better defend themselves, but it also allowed attacks such as these to become more frequent. Some iron tools, such as knives and axes, doubled up as defensive weapons in the Iron Age, but early humans could also reinforce existing weaponry with metal, making it more durable and more deadly. Swords came into play around 3300 BC, and humans soon began to tip spears and arrows with sharp metal points. These could be used in hunting and warfare, meaning that these ancient people now needed a means of defending themselves from attack. While animal hides could be tanned to produce basic leather clothing that would provide a degree of defense against attack, the discovery of copper, bronze, and iron meant that humans could encase themselves in metal suits of armor to significantly reduce the risk of being killed in a raid or a battle. Some of the earliest suits of armor come from prehistoric Greece, where examples such as the Dendra panoply show a full-body protective suit made from bronze. Scale armor would soon be produced across Eurasia and North Africa, which formed the basis of the historical armor sets we associate with these regions today. As humans began to progress out of the Pleistocene and into the Holocene, it became clear that their beliefs, both cultural and spiritual, were developing with them. Some of the greatest insights into these ancient practices come from Starkar, an archaeological site located in what is today the county of North Yorkshire in northern England. From roughly 11,200 to 10,600 years ago, early Holocene humans thrived here and left behind a wealth of information about the way they lived their lives. Here, however, amongst the evidence of woodworking and hunting, strange artifacts that resemble headdresses have been found. Created from the skulls and antlers of red deer that would have been abundant in the region thousands of years ago, these objects likely had religious or spiritual significance, with priests or leaders donning them during rituals, dances, and ceremonies. This Mesolithic community likely had a belief system tied to the natural world, with multiple deities creating a pantheon that could help them explain the sun and moon, wind and rain, and the rivers and seas. There would likely not have been any formal religious institutions, such as temples, at Starkar, and instead, the stories of the gods would have been passed around bonfires and feasts following hunts. Later, in the Neolithic, designated places of worship begin to appear, At the site of Çatalhöyük in what is today Turkey, shrine-like structures have been found amidst the closely packed buildings that may have allowed locals to place offerings to the gods or reinforce their beliefs. The first examples of structures that are believed to be true temples can be found in Turkey's Göbekli Tepe, which were constructed around 9600 BCE. These monument-like structures would have served similar purposes and may have been the sites of religious or ceremonial gatherings for these ancient people. Another way for Holocene humans to express their beliefs and cultural identity was through the medium of art. Sculptures and paintings had long since been part of the human repertoire prior to the onset of the Holocene, and only grew more complex and intricate after the ice melted and the world warmed. Sculptures, often in the form of animals and stylized humans, appear across settlements the world over, which likely indicate these people's strong ties and beliefs surrounding the natural world and nature's processes. Deer, wild cattle, horses and more are frequent characters in early Holocene art, which may have been used to denote animals that were suitable for hunting or for more deep-set religious purposes. In the Neolithic period, the nature of art changed once again, especially with the development of pottery across the globe. Pottery could be painted with charcoals and ochres, and often depicted everything from people and animals to basic geometric patterns such as bands or zigzags. Another key feature of ancient Holocene art are the megalithic stone monuments that were set up across much of Europe and Asia. These could take on a variety of forms. Menhirs were the most common, which were single standing stones likely used for religious ceremonies and meetings. But megaliths could also be used to create tombs and mark resting places. Dolmens and cairns were just two examples of funerary standing stones, where the dead could be interned and commemorated in tandem with ancient religious beliefs. Some of the most spectacular megalithic structures are the awe-inspiring stone circles that can be found across Eurasia, such as the famous Stonehenge. The structure, perhaps the world's most famous ancient ceremonial site, may have been used to observe the summer and winter solstices, potentially tracking celestial movements while celebrating life, nature, and ancient pantheons of gods. Before long, when settlements became permanent and started to expand past a certain point, cultures and identities would be narrowed down into civilizations. Again, the Fertile Crescent was among the first places on Earth to harbor advanced civilizations, with the arrival of the Sumerians in around 4000 BC. With civilization came the world's first cities, such as Uruk and Ur, and before long, writing systems were invented that allowed humans to keep track of their histories, culture, and to make notes that were important on a day-to-day basis. Civilization would find itself spreading across the globe across the following centuries and millennia, spreading first to South and East Asia, and eventually to Southern Europe. The spread of humanity across the globe during the Holocene Epoch has not been without its consequences on the world that once cradled us. Just as we may have been responsible for the downfall of the Pleistocene megafauna, a string of additional extinctions took place as humans spread into the remote regions of the world where large animals could formerly avoid our presence. Some animals from groups that are closely associated with the Pleistocene did even manage to hold on until the early Holocene, until humans overhunted them and they disappeared from our world forever. North America's large animal biodiversity was severely affected by the spread of humans across the start of the Holocene. After the Ice Age, some megafauna did survive, in the form of Nothrotheriops shastensis, or the Shasta ground sloth. The sloth, which measured roughly 2.75 meters, or 9 feet long, was a resident of the La Brea tar pits in California, one of the richest fossil sites for late Pleistocene and early Holocene America. Hair and dung belonging to the species have been recovered from caves, which may have forced early humans seeking shelter into direct competition with the species. They may also have hunted the sloth for its meat and fur, which eventually led it to its demise around 10,000 years ago. Another Holocene victim was Civilisation scotti, the enormous stag moose, a native of what is now the eastern United States. The last members of this species died out just as the Holocene began, 11,500 years ago, and again, it was likely a victim of overhunting. Given the animal's immense size, it would have been a prize target for bands of nomadic humans forming settlements at the start of the Holocene, who wanted to hunt it for its meat. The Holocene also saw the disappearance of the tapir from North America, as well as the final surviving glyptodonts, large armadillo relatives, and the mighty saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis. In Eurasia, mammoths were eradicated from most of the mainland, but did not go extinct until around 4,000 years ago. The last mammoths were confined to the remote reaches of Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia. Sadly, with very little genetic variation in their species, the last few woolly mammoths were heavily inbred and likely racked with health problems due to the population bottleneck created with being confined to an island. Extreme weather and freak storms could have bolstered their disappearance, although humans are not thought to have played a part in the extinction of these island populations. Overhunting is thought to have finished off the last of the Irish elk populations, as well as those of the aurochs. The latter, a species of giant cattle that gave rise to modern cows, actually managed to remain extant until 1627, but its various subspecies slowly disappeared from the world over the course of the early Holocene. Extinctions of large animals tended to take place when humans first arrived in the regions. Throughout the course of the Holocene, we have lost the elephant birds and sloth lemurs of Madagascar, the giant owls of Cuba, the moas of New Zealand and the South Pacific, and countless species in between. Unfortunately, these extinctions persist with the advancement of humankind across the planet, and we find ourselves at risk of losing even more species as we advance into the modern day. Climate change, overhunting, and the destruction of habitats is just as much of a real threat now as it was during the end of the Ice Age. We're still living in the Holocene today, but some argue that a new age, the Anthropocene, should be introduced to describe the vast state of change we have experienced since the rise of man, advanced technology, and global expansion. Today, all from our early roots in the woodlands of the early Holocene, we have managed to expand across the world, conquer each and any environment we come across, and develop technologies to help us master most of the problems that come our way. We are more than a global species. We are a force, both for good and bad, on this green planet of ours.